Anne Boleyn, a woman so seductive, she charmed her way into becoming the Queen of England. 3 short years later, she was tried, convicted, and lost her head. She was immensely charismatic, a flirt, a gambler, a true courtier who could make any man feel attractive. She set her sights on the biggest prize of all, King Henry VIII, and the man fell wildly in love. It was not an overnight success. Anne spent years fanning the flames of the relationship, only to fall from grace. So how did Anne Boleyn go from the top spot to head chopped in such record time? Was she a scam artist that received well-deserved justice, or a victim of the cruel and often murky world of Tudor politics? Join us as we dig into the past and fast forward through the history of Anne Boleyn. You will not want to miss the shocking details that led to the downfall of one of the most fascinating women in English history at the end of this video. The exact date of Anne Boleyn's birth is unknown, and is estimated between 1501 and 1507. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, was from a wealthy and influential family, and was even a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Anne's father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a powerful diplomat, and also favoured by the Tudor court. Needless to say, Anne grew up in a privileged household with her sister Mary and brother George at Hever Castle. She was a quick-witted and intelligent child, with a love of learning and a talent for languages. It was clear that Anne was fiercely ambitious, with dreams of rising to the top of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn received a comprehensive education deemed appropriate for a noblewoman. Her father used his clout and had arranged for her to join the royal court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria. After a year, Anne was called to the French court, where she would stay between 1515 to 1521. It was an opportunity of a lifetime. Her immersion in French culture provided Anne with a cosmopolitan education that most women in England could have only dreamt about. Anne learned to speak French fluently, giving her a diplomatic advantage. She was exposed to all of the sophistication and glamour of French cultures, like the arts, music, and dance. And then, of course, there was French fashion. All of the latest trends that would have aided in the cultivation of her personal style. Everything about French culture would have ultimately given Anne a special edge over her female counterparts back in England. But there was something else in particular that Anne was exposed to at the French court, something that truly would have benefited her aspirations: courtly love and seduction. French literature and art during the Renaissance celebrated the pursuit of love and the art of seduction, and this would have been a major influence on Anne's ideas about romantic relationships. She would have bore witness to the French court's elaborate rituals of courtship and learned about the use of wit, charm, and flattery as tools of seduction. Additionally, Anne would have steeped in the more liberal attitude towards passions of love compared to the conservative Tudor court. There is little doubt her beliefs and abilities toward love and seduction would have taken shape in this atmosphere. In 1522, Anne Boleyn made her debut at the Tudor court in England. She was only 21 years old and, like her mother before her, received the distinguished position as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. This was a prestigious position, to be sure, but Anne would not be content to simply languish in an obedient attendant role. No, Anne was determined to make her mark on the world. She would have understood that royal courts were a den of intrigue, gossip, and backstabbing, but Anne was confident in her abilities. It wasn't long before she became a favorite at court with her wit, charm, and beauty. Given Anne's travels and liberal views that were nourished in France, she conceivably felt above others at court, and this would not have gone unnoticed. Her attitude likely garnered jealousy amongst the coterie. Was the young Anne Boleyn confident in her powers, Or did she act out of arrogance, as the young often do? In any case, she navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, fended off rivals, and caught the attention of the king. In 1528, Anne Boleyn became involved with King Henry VIII. Henry was still married to Catherine of Aragon, but it was becoming clear to all that the king was growing increasingly frustrated with the queen's inability to produce a male heir. The women of the court, emboldened by familial misfortune, were subtly lining up to become the king's next mistress. The standout favourite for King Henry VIII was Anne Boleyn. She was unlike any other woman he had ever met. Opinionated, worldly, and religious. But Anne was no fool. She knew that she had to play her cards carefully if she wanted to become queen. Once Anne had used all of her wit, charm, and beauty to win the king's favour, she took a massive gamble and refused to become Henry's mistress. The risk paid off, and the king fell madly in love. In a letter dated January 1528, Henry demonstrates the emotional distress Anne's absence was causing. "The uneasiness of my mind since your departure has been such that I was obliged to send for Dr. Butts, who has prescribed for me as for a person who is too much in love." In another letter of the time, Henry wrote, "If you give yourself up, heart, body, and soul to me, I will take you for my only mistress, rejecting from thought and affection all others save yourself, to serve only you." She famously dismissed Henry's romantic overtures. Instead, Anne insisted on marriage and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to her spectacular rise and disastrous fall. Henry, desperate to annul his marriage to Catherine, began the process of breaking away from the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England. He declared himself the head of the church and granted himself a divorce, paving the way for his marriage to Anne. Henry may have enjoyed his relationship with Anne in the relative privacy of the court, but he underestimated the public's response. It is said that the coronation of the new queen in 1533 was like a funeral, and it was obvious she was disliked by the public. There were many who remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon and viewed Anne as a home-wrecker. Others held Anne responsible for the religious war that had now been unleashed between Catholics and Protestants. The birth of Princess Elizabeth may have provided some hope for a future son, but Anne was not in the clear just yet. She needed to cement her place as a royal, and first, she needed to provide Henry with a male heir. As time went on, Anne's prospects for a son grew dim. She suffered several miscarriages and gave birth to a stillborn son, which only added to her troubles. The women at court could smell Anne's desperation and began to vie for Henry's attention. According to historical accounts, Anne Boleyn became furious when she discovered her rival, Jane Seymour, wearing a piece of jewelry that was originally gifted to her by the king. This caused a heated argument between the two women. Anne's desperation would have no doubt detracted from her charms and opened the door for her enemies to strike. One such enemy, unbeknownst to Anne, was Henry VIII himself. He believed in divine right and saw his role as king as being appointed by God. So, when the Queen was unable to produce a male heir, Henry began to see it as a sign from God that their union was cursed. It is said that he even began to consider Anne had bewitched him, blaming her for their misfortunes. In one instance, Henry claimed to have had a dream in which Anne was represented by a dead tree, which he took as a symbol of her infertility. These beliefs only added to the growing rift between the couple. Queen Anne Boleyn didn't just have public detractors and her husband's religious paranoia to contend with. She had also made enemies with the conservative faction at court. Influential figures such as Thomas Cromwell, Thomas More, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner viewed Anne and her supporters as dangerous heretics who threatened the traditional Catholic practices of the Church. Additionally, Anne's strong personality and power within the court could have made her a target for those who feared the influence she so easily wielded over the king at the outset of their marriage. Anne's detractors would have relished any opportunity to bring about her downfall, and that's exactly what they would set about to accomplish. Over the course of 2 or more years, Anne had failed to produce a male heir, and her relationship with Henry grew increasingly strained. Henry had outwardly grown disillusioned with his marriage to Anne, and it was at just this time that rumors began to circulate about Anne's alleged betrayals. On May 15th, 1536, Anne was rocked by multiple explosive accusations and was promptly detained, along with a number of her suspected accomplices and presumed lovers. The trial was a high-profile event. Although the king did not attend the trial, he was closely involved in the proceedings and is believed to have played an active role in orchestrating Anne's downfall. During the trial, Anne was accused of having affairs with several men, including her own brother, and of plotting to kill the king. Many historians believe that the evidence presented against Anne was flimsy at best. It is by all accounts considered a rigged case. Who could have been behind the fabrications and exaggerations used to ensure a conviction? It is believed that a number of individuals may have been behind the plot to have Anne arrested and tried, including Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister at the time, and a previous ally of Anne's. Perhaps Cromwell was all too motivated to secure the king's favour and protect his position at court. Then there was the Duke of Norfolk and his son, Thomas Howard. They were publicly opposed to Anne's religious and political views. On May 19th, 1536, 4 days after the trial began, Anne Boleyn was found guilty and convicted of high treason and adultery. It was at the Tower of London where Anne was escorted to make her final speech. There she met swordsman Jean Rambaud. It's interesting to note that he had already arrived from France days earlier for his skills. It was as if Anne's fate was sealed before the trial even began. With a single stroke, the Queen met her tragic end. The events that led to Anne's downfall have been the subject of much debate over the years. Some historians believe that she was the victim of a conspiracy, orchestrated by her enemies at court, who were jealous of her rise to power. Others argue that she was indeed guilty of adultery, and that her fate was the result of her own actions. One thing is clear: Anne Boleyn was determined to make her mark on the world, and was not afraid to use her wits and charm to get ahead. She took great risk to seduce a powerful man into a scandalous public divorce that led to a break with the Roman Catholic Church. The establishment of the Church of England would go on to become a major force in the religious and political history of England and the world. It is unreasonable to call Anne a scam artist for being bold and charismatic. Yet in the process of achieving her personal success, Anne Boleyn made countless enemies who did label her as a scam artist, and she was undoubtedly the victim of her own success.